Cantwell Clark began making custom fishing rods for family and friends more than 30 years ago. Better known in rod building circles by his nickname Cam, he has been an active participant in national RodCrafters seminars, where very often his subject has been some aspect of weaving. In 1989, he became editor of RodCrafters Journal.
I'd like to show you how you can use your regular rod winding threads to create pictorial designs on your custom fishing rods. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to do a single letter. We're going to do it as a one-color silhouette, and we're going to do it on a single axis of the rod. And while we're talking about rod axis, let's make sure we're all talking the same thing. The zero axis of a rod, when it is being fished, is that axis, is that imaginary line which runs from butt to tip along the top of the rod as it's being fished. I mention that because most anglers who have custom designs on their rods prefer to have them on that zero axis so that it shows as the rod is being fished. Now, similarly, if you want an additional design, it may well be around the rod halfway, which would be on the 180-degree axis. I'll put this back here. Going now to weaving, let's do a little bit of background on the actual steps of weaving. And this is talking about textile weaving, and I'd like to go to the conference pad now and show you how our weaving is so similar to standard textile weaving. This first chart shows plain weaving as is done in the normal textile sense of the word. There are a number of black threads here that are warp threads, and there are a number of brown threads along like this which are called filling threads, and they're interlaced as the fabric is woven, one thread at a time. And this is a standard basket weave or plain weave or broadcloth fabric that we have all seen many times in our daily life. It's the kind of weaving that's been going on for several thousand years. It's the kind of weaving that produces the broadcloth for your shirts, the bed sheeting for your beds, and with linen threads, it would produce napkins for your table. Now, the only difference between this kind of weaving, which is textile weaving and is done in a single flat plane, is the next step which adapts it to our usage, which is cylindrical weaving. Here we have taken those same warp and filling threads and put them on a cylindrical surface such as we'll be using to weave on a rod. Again, the black threads running lengthwise of the rod are warp threads, and this brown thread that is spiraling around the rod this way is the same filling thread that you ran into in textile weaving. This, however, is coming from the supply spool of your rod lathe. But again, you are wrapping the filling threads around the rod as you move the warp threads back and forth to create your weaving. Let's now develop some actual block diagrams for several letters that we'll be working on later in the tape. To give you a little bit of background, you ought to choose letter proportions that are pleasing to you. I find that in block diagrams, I like a letter that is about 13 threads wide and about 16 threads high. You'll notice this I has 16 threads high, but of course it's a narrow letter. It only has 2 threads in width. And you'll see a little bit later with a standard letter such as the R and the S that we'll work on, they will be 16 threads wide, 13 threads wide. But the way you develop the block diagram here is to draw the I and determine, as we talked earlier, which threads must be to the left to be in the diagram. And obviously all of them must be, so the left list says that threads 1 through 16 must be to the left for the first vertical thread. And as a matter of fact, it must be for the second one. So our left list is quite simple. It shows that threads 1 through 16 are to the left for both vertical threads. You set the weave up, move every thread to the left, turn your rod twice, move every thread back to the right, and you have woven an I. Let's go now to a full-sized letter. Here's the letter S. You'll notice we still have the same 16 horizontal threads running lengthwise of the rod. But now we have a full width from threads 1 through 13, the vertical threads that will be forming the pattern. We'll look first at vertical thread number 1, which is shown here, and that means that every thread that shows, every horizontal thread that shows to the left of my pointer must be to the left of the design as you are making the rod rotation. That means threads 3, 4, 5, and 6, as well as 13 and 14. Take those thread numbers and transfer them to your left list, showing 3 through 6 and 13 through 14. Let's go next to vertical thread number 2. You'll see that 3 through 6 and 13 and 14 are still to the left, but in addition we have 2 and 7 and 15 are also moved to the left. So leave vertical thread 1 threads to the left and add these additional 3 threads. So the left list for vertical thread number 2 shows 2 through 7 and 13 through 15. Similarly, you take 1 thread at a time and go 3, 4, 5 on through to 13, for instance. And here you'll note that vertical thread 13 has horizontal threads 3 and 4 to the left, as well as 9 through 14. And you'll note here on the left list that for thread 13, 3 and 4, as well as 9 through 14 are shown to the left. Similarly, here is another full-length letter, the R. And I'm showing you this now because you're going to be weaving it later on an actual rod blank. So that while we're developing patterns here, I thought we might as well do the R. It is the same 16 horizontal threads, the same 13 vertical threads, the same development of a left list. So this is the left list that we will use a little bit later on in the tape to weave an R on an actual rod blank. You've seen how we go from standard textile weaving to cylindrical weaving on a rod blank. Now let's talk about the steps that are necessary to create a weave on that rod blank. There are really 4 steps. One is to actually create the design on paper. Next is to lay out the threads on the rod. Then you actually weave the design, and then you trim and finish it. Now in creating the design, which as we said earlier is usually a single color silhouette, you may use any source you want for that design. You can use letters that you either draw up yourself, or you may find them in a letter handbook. You can find them in books, in newspapers. Make your own drawings. The size of them ought to be about 8 or 10 inches in the horizontal direction. If you don't have that size that you find in a book or a magazine, well, you can photocopy it up or down depending upon which you need. But the important point is to come up with a drawing that's about 8 or 10 inches in the major direction, and then go from the starting drawing that you have found into a block diagram. And let me show you what I'm talking about here. I wanted to weave a whale at one time, and here is the best side view of a whale that I could find. It was in an encyclopedia. So I traced that from the picture in the encyclopedia. Next, I photo enlarged it to that size, and that's about the proper length to create a 1-inch design in A thread on the rod. I didn't like the tail on the picture in the magazine, so I drew my own whale tail and came up with something that looked like that. And that I felt was appealing, so the next step was to go to 10 by 10 graph paper and draw what I call a block diagram. And this is a diagram that you will use to determine which threads go to the left and which threads go to the right as you make your weave. Now that sounds like it's complicated, but this is based on the principle that any thread that appears in the final design, in the body of the whale for instance, must be to the left of the design area as you rotate your rod to put your vertical threads in, put your filling threads in. Any thread that does not appear should be to the right. Now, we mentioned A thread a moment ago. Talk a quick moment about that. I usually do A thread in most of my designs. If you want to start with a heavier thread such as D, that would be all right, but I think you'll find that the jaggedness of the design, since you are having kind of a sawtooth edge as you move threads back and forth, would be less pleasing with D than it would be with A. So I would think you would want to work to an A thread fairly soon after you get some experience. Again, if you have an A thread with a design in the block diagram that is 10 inches long, you'll come up with about a 1-inch design on the rod. You've seen from the conference pad how to develop a block diagram, and from that block diagram a left list for the letter I. Let's go now to an actual cylindrical weaving arrangement and weave a letter I. We have here a piece of 3-inch PVC pipe on which are arranged 16 horizontal red threads and 1 vertical white thread coming from the rod lathe spool up to the top of the picture. I have turned the rod 3 times to give a blank left margin. Now the first thing to do is to move all of these threads according to the left list. And you've noticed by the left list it calls for threads 1 through 16 to be to the left. We move all 16 threads to the left. Now you can start from the middle, the top, or the bottom, but in order to keep that white thread taut, it's best to start from the bottom of a horizontal array. So I'm going to move 16 first and move this to the left. Then 15, 14, 13, 3, 2, and 1. The rod 1 turn to get a layer of white thread on there. Make sure you make a check mark on your left list to show that you've completed that step. If you continue to show on your left list a tally of what you've done, you can be interrupted at any time without losing your place. You can stop and have lunch, go off and have a night's sleep, a telephone call, or whatever. Now the left list calls for the second vertical thread also to have 1 through 16 to the left, so we'll just make a second turn. Here we have 2 threads with all threads to the left. Now we've got to bring them all back to the right to complete the left list. So there's thread 16 going back, thread 15, 14, 13, 3, 2, and 1. Take another 3 turns to provide a right-hand margin similar to the left-hand margin we started with. And there is a very poor I. I say very poor because it's not completed yet. What you must do now is make sure that the rod weaving is completed by stretching the horizontal threads so that they're taut in the pattern area in here between my 2 forefingers. Hold your thumb here to make sure you don't pull this out of the pattern and stretch thread number 16, number 15, number 14, and so on like this. You'll notice as I pull with my right hand, the areas in here will tighten up, and that's what you're trying to do, is to make sure they're good and taut and don't have any softness and loopiness in the final design. This is taking care of half of the packing of the weave. This is the horizontal portion. And it looks better in that sense. What we need to do now is to pack the vertical thing and get rid of these gaps that you see along here. So let's just push them together like this. Now this is perfectly all right on this large scale to do it with fingernails and thumbs. You would probably use a burnishing tool such as this if you were doing it on your actual threads, and we will see how that works later on when we actually weave on a piece of rod blank. But I suggest to you that that's not a bad looking eye, woven the way you would normally do it on standard rod weaving. Right, we've just woven the I, which admittedly is a very simple letter. Let's go now to the S that we developed on the conference pad and get that left list and weave an S on this same enlarged PVC pipe. Here again I've started with 3 turns to the left to provide framing, and we look at the left list and find that we want threads 3 through 6 and 13 and 14 to the left. Now you recall in the I that we keep our rod lathe spool thread here tighter if we work from the bottom. So I'm going to move thread 14 first and put it over to the left, and then thread 13, and then come up and take number 6, number 5, number 4, and number 3. That has moved 4 of those threads to the left. Now here's my left list. I'm going to move those to the left. I already have. I'm going to put a check mark there, so if I have to have a phone call or something, I can be interrupted now. I'm going to make one turn of the rod and get ready for the next step. Now this next step on the left list says that threads 2 through 7 and 13 through 15. That means we have to bring number 15 over and place it alongside 13 and 14, which were already there. Similarly, we have to bring threads 7 and 2 over. I've moved those. I'm going to put a check mark on the left list. Take one turn of the spool thread, the vertical thread, and I'm ready to move again. Now the left list calls for vertical thread number 3 to have moved left horizontal threads 1 through 3, 6 through 8, and 14 through 16. So we have 16 coming over here to the left, and 13, being no longer in the design, will be brought back to the right. Similarly, thread 8 comes over and joins these others, but threads 5 and 4 return to the right. And we complete the layout for this stage by bringing thread number 1. Now we have threads 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, and 8, and 14, 15, and 16. They are moved. I'm going to make a check mark on my left list. Turn the rod one turn and prepare for the next. Here we have 1 and 2, 7 and 8, and 15 and 16. That means that 13 returns to the right. That means that 6 returns to the right. It means that 3 returns to the right. Now we're ready for one turn of the rod. And I check that on my left list. And I look and see that the next 6 turns are the same as the fourth, as the one we just did. And I have it marked ditto here. It could also be abbreviated DO period, but that means that we just go ahead and make no changes from left to the right and just turn the rod 6 more times. We get a free ride as far as left to right movement. So here is one turn, back it up here, 2 turns, 3 turns, 4 turns, and 5 additional turns, which gives us a total of 6. I get my left list, and I'm going to put these check marks in here. And I see that the next set of moves calls for 1 through 3, 7 through 9, and 14 through 16. All right, that means we bring 14 back over. We bring 9 back over. Now here's a problem that you have to watch out for. I brought this 14 so far over that it overlapped that white thread, so don't pull so hard that you overlap that. Here again, I'll release that a little bit so that it'll make a smooth, even wind. And bring thread number 3 back to the left. I've got those moved. Check it off on my left list and see that the next step is 2 through 4 and 8 through 15. So I'll make my turn here, and I want 8 through 15. All right, 16 is no longer in the picture, so we put it back here. Move 13 over, 12, 11, 10, 9 and 8 were over, so we'll bring 7 back to the right. And we want 2 through 4. 4 must come back to the left, and 1 returns to the right. I've moved those according to the left list, so I'll check it off. Now the final vertical thread is number 13. It calls for number 3, 4, and 9 through 14. So I'll make my one turn here. 9 through 14 means 15 comes back. 8 comes back. So this is 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. That checks that. 3 and 4, so that means number 2 has to come over here. So now I have 3 and 4 and these other lower ones. I've moved those threads, so I'll check it off on my left list and turn the rod once more. Now we're through except for returning everything to the right. So here come these final threads returning where they started to the right. The next step is to put the same blank framing to the right of the design. And there again is an S, but it's a poor S because we haven't packed it or tamped it. So let's do that same job, holding it tightly here, and we're going to pull in this direction on thread number 16, 15, and you can see them moving here around where my thumb is located. But you need to get them all taut so that they'll make a nice, flat, appealing design that you've just woven. That has all 16 of them stretched horizontally. Now we'll come ahead and use our thumbnails and fingernails to tighten the weave vertically and get rid of these gaps. And there is your letter S that's been packed vertically as well as stretched horizontally. And there is a letter S woven on your 3-inch diameter PVC pipe. We'll stop using the large scale operation here and go to the next step to actually weave the R that we laid out on the conference pad. But this time we'll weave it on an actual rod blank. You've seen how on the 3-inch piece of PVC pipe we wove the S. You've seen on the conference pad how we developed the left list for the S as well as the R. What I'd like to do now is use an actual rod lathe and an actual rod blank and weave the R for you. The first thing you need to do is be sure that everything is clean, because anything in the way of greases and oils on the rod can bleed through the weave and make a messy looking product for you. So I'm using normal alcohol. Regular rubbing alcohol is fine, and I will rub the blank down and clean out the area that I'm going to weave. That's sufficient for that. Next, I'm going to place bands of tape on the blank to hold the thread in place either to the left or to the right of the design being woven. And to do that, I use regular masking tape. You have a choice whether you use regular masking tape or double stick tape, because you want the adhesive out so that it'll hold the threads in place. I choose to go regular tape because the double stick tape adhesive doesn't stand up very long for me. So what I'm going to do is put on 7 bands of regular masking tape, which I will put on as I'm showing you here, and then I will reverse it for several turns to get the adhesive side out, and there is one band started. I usually use 1/2-inch tape for those threads that are to the left and to the right, and just as a marker for me, I use 1/2-inch tape to hold the left ends of the horizontal threads. But again, you're putting on bands like this and reversing to get the adhesive side out. Now I'm putting on a band 1/2-inch here, just to be a key as to where the center of the pattern is. You notice I haven't smoothed down any of those tapes. I've left tag ends, and I've done that on purpose, because you'll notice also that I have not touched this adhesive side of the tape with my bare hands at all. And you ought to avoid touching the adhesive, because the oils and greases of one's hands can kill the adhesive long before you're through with a weaving session. And it can be very disconcerting to have a nice weave set up and you're practically through and the threads start falling off of your tape anchors. I would use a bodkin then to smooth those tape bands down, making sure that I don't touch any adhesives with my bare hand. So here are 7 bands of tape. We will put the left-hand ends of the horizontal threads on this 1/2-inch tape here and have them extend out here to the right. But before you do that, what you want to do is to mark the center line of your diagram, because you want to be sure and have that on the 0 axis of the rod. Now we've marked the 0 axis of the rod to be right here. And what I'm going to do is to put a pencil point at that and another pencil point here. Then I'm going to use a straight edge, such as that, to make a mark on each of these tape anchors so that you can see where the center line of your design falls. I don't know whether this will show that, but there's a center line running right through there, and we're going to put 16 threads spaced so that half of them are above that center line and half of them are below it. I have the red horizontal thread here, and what I'm going to do is to put that on the tape anchors, starting with the center here, and go right on up this way and cut it off. There is thread number 8 or thread number 9, because we're starting in the center here. That's 8. There is 7. There is 6. There's 5. Number 4, number 10. And let me stop now and make a comment. You're going to want to identify the threads that you're weaving here. Know which thread number is which. I choose to mark every 10th thread. And what I do is tie an overhand knot in that thread. Here's number 10. I place the overhand knot about there. That identifies thread number 10 for me as I'm going through the job of weaving. And we'll come back to those identifying marks shortly. That's thread number 11. Thread number 12. Thread number 13. Thread number 14. Number 15. And number 16. Talking a little bit more about thread numbering, if I were to go on and have 20 or 25 or 30 threads here, I would tie 2 overhand knots in number 20. I'd tie 3 in number 30. If it went so far as to go 40 threads, I would tie 1 there, because numbers 10 and 40 are so far apart that you're not going to mix the 2 of them up. Right, I think I have 16 there, but again, I want to be darn sure before I start weaving, so I'm going to recheck. I'll recount. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 with the knot in it, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. There are 16 there. It's safe now that you've recounted to bind these left ends of these horizontal threads tightly with masking tape. You're not going to want to change those until this job is done. There are your 16 threads, and we're about to start weaving. So let me digress for a moment and show you the tools that I think you ought to be using. First, we need to talk about hooks, because one of the things you have to do is to reach into this bundle here with some sort of a tool and get your hooks out so that you can, and get your threads out so that you can use them. I use 3 different hooks. There's a straight hook, there is a curved hook, and there's a larger hook. All 3 of them are useful. You will need bodkins. You've seen me already using this one to smooth threads along here, to smooth the tape down. Here are 2 different ones. This is a needle stuck into a piece of dowel. This is a needle that is glued into a piece of brass hex stock. Those things can be very useful. You'll need thread burnishers. There are 2 types. This one is the usual round metal with a square cross-section tip. They're good for packing edgewise. There are other burnishing tools that are very useful. This is a particular useful tool. It's the dentist's wax spatula with a nice smooth point there, and if you want to smooth things down, it burnishes very well, such as that. If you have particular localized areas where you need to burnish, there are dental tools called ball burnishers. There is one of them showing different end treatments. This allows you to take an individual place that needs burnishing and treat it that way. Scissors, of course, are important, and I happen to prefer the pinch scissors. Then I don't have to worry about getting my fingers in them. Just pick them up and pinch them, and that takes care of cutting the threads off here. Later on, you're going to need to cut very close to the wrap, and I think a fine pointed scissor is good here. I happen to like to use tweezers to handle threads that I have to push through loops and so forth, because they're a little more precise than my blunt fingers. A pencil, of course, for marking. Paint brushes. I have a separate brush for the 2 jobs that we'll be doing, one for color preservative and thread sealer, the other one a separate brush for epoxy finish. In both cases, it's worthwhile to spend money to get good ones. All right, we have laid out the horizontal threads. We're going to be starting now to put in the vertical thread that comes from the spool of the rod lathe. In the past, we were using white thread, but I was afraid that that would not show up against the white blank, so I've used a yellow thread here, and I'm going to start that and wrap it around the blank. And you'll recall on the PVC pipe that we had a margin of blank weaving to the left of about 3 threads. Now I'm going to make this a little bit more appealing on the full-size rod, and I'm going to do 20 turns here. There are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. Now it's safe to use one's scalpel and cut off the tag end of the yellow thread here. We're now ready for weaving step number 1. And if you look at the left list, you'll see that for the R that we're about to weave, threads 1 through 16 must be to the left. Let's pick a good pair of hooks and weaving tools, and my preference these days is for my right hand to use a hook such as that, and my left hand this slightly distorted tip to a bodkin. So what I'm going to do, you'll recall again on the PVC pipe that to keep the yellow thread tight, we work from the bottom of the design, and that lets the yellow thread stay good and taut as you weave. So I'm going to start out here with thread number 16 and bring it to the left. Again, I'm not touching the sticky part of the adhesive with my hands, only with the bodkin. Move this yellow thread a little bit to the right to make sure I don't fold it under. Continue to move these threads like this. I know that's thread number 10 because I could feel the overhand knot as it went through my finger. It's a good idea to be aware of that as you weave, because that will save you an awful lot of counting down from time to time through the weave. You will be aware from your left list that a certain thread at a number 20 or 30 or 40, one of them with the overhand knots, is due to be moved in that particular session, and you'll know by just feeling it go through your hand that it has occurred at the right time, and you'll know you're on target with the left list. There are some weavers I've talked to who think that it's much simpler to, when they have all 16, to go to the left, to pick them out all at once and move them all at once. And that frame of mind doesn't usually last too long, because they usually find out that they get them crossed up somewhere either to the left or the right, and when the final woven pattern is completed, you'll see some crossed ends in there which are particularly unattractive. So I would urge you to do these things one at a time, even though it may appear to be tedious. There we are with all 16 threads to the left. Now the left list says that we are to go all 16 to the left for 1, and actually there's a ditto there, so we may have 2 turns of the rod while all 16 are to the left. So what I'm going to do is to turn once, turn twice, and then go back to the left list and see what I do next. The left list next says that threads 1 and 2 and 7 and 8 remain to the left, which means everything else is to the right. So again, starting from the bottom, I'm going to move thread number 16 back to the right. That's 16, 15, this is 14. And I'm not really concerned with keeping track of these as they go along, because I know they all come back, so I just make it a point to bring them all back except for 7 and 8 and 1 and 2. But here comes the first checkpoint. There's that knotted thread. That's number 10, so I'm going to start counting again now. That's number 10. This is number 9. Now I know that the next two are 8 and 7 and must remain to the left, so I'm going to skip over 2 threads and pick up the one above that. I'm not going to bother to count to that number 6 because I know it's got to be number 6 because it's above 7. So there I've left 7 and 8 to the left, and I'm bringing 6 back to the right. Be sure when you put it down that you leave room on your tape anchors so that you can put 7 and 8 back to the right when you need to. That's 6 moved over. There's 5. There's 4. And there's 3. Now, rechecking the left list, we're supposed to have left 2, 1 and 2, and 7 and 8. And sure enough, we have 1 and 2 and 7 and 8. Now the left list says that we may turn the rod a total of 6 times. There's 1 turn, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I might be called to the phone, so I'm going to check those off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now the left list tally is all up to date. For the next thread, we have the same 4 threads to the left and move over also 9 and 10. So here comes thread number 9. And there's number 10. And as if I didn't know it, the knot kept through my hand, and that just checks that I have been doing right so far, because that's number 10. The left list, check off that step. As you can see from this close-up, the pattern of the R is about to develop. I'll complete the final step here by moving thread number 7 back to the right, and thread number 2 back to the right. And that is the final movement of thread that we need to make. One more turn with the rod, and that completes the left list, and what we need to do is return all of these remaining threads to the right hand side of the design. I don't really worry about what thread numbers they are now because they're all going back here and they're going back in appropriate sequence. And I think you'll see by the way things are developing now as we uncover them here, the R is looking better and better with each thread that we move. There is the final number of the threads, numbers of the 16 threads moved back to the right, and you can see it's a fairly good R. So I'm going to turn this around, halfway around to the 180-degree axis, add a pull-out loop such as that, and then I'm going to put 20 turns on the rod for the right-hand margin. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And now I'm going to cut the yellow thread and tuck it into the pull-out loop. I'm not going to exercise the pull-out loop yet because I might find a mistake that I need to backtrack on. So I'm going to pull out just until it snugs that thread up against the yellow wrap. I'm going to put the pull-out loop down and the yellow thread down, and come back and look at my R. And it's a reasonable R, but it still looks a little bit sloppy. What we need to do is the same thing we did with the 3-inch PVC pipe, and pull horizontally and then pack vertically. Now here, it's particularly important to hold the left-hand end of those red threads as you pull against the right-hand end. If you don't hold those, you may find that you've done a beautiful weave, but as you pull horizontally, you pull a thread or two out, and it's going to spoil your whole day. So what I would suggest that you do is to divide the threads into 2 halves. Take about 8 of those threads, take them from the right-hand tape anchor and let it drop down below. Take the other 8 and put them above the design. And now go one at a time and tug against them horizontally. I'm going to use my left thumb to hold against that, and I'm going to pull tightly to the right here until I see the thread move in between the yellow and the tape band. There is one of them tightened, and then I put it back down where it was. Tight with your thumb. And keep on doing this for all 16 of the threads. One of the things that serves to remind me of this is the number 17. And that's because thread number 17 was the thread that made the cabin of a sport fisherman I was weaving once. And when I came to pulling that thread out to tighten it, I forgot to hold it with my left thumb. And lo and behold, I pulled it completely out of the pattern and had to go with an open cockpit fishing boat then. So I'll never forget thread number 17. I hope you don't have an unfortunate pull out like that. But I'd suggest that you'll do it once and you'll never forget again. Here again, I'm pulling each thread, anchoring the thread after it's been pulled to the right-hand tape anchors. I've done the top 8, now I'll go to the bottom 8. Still pulling threads to the right. I'm almost through. I'm down to thread number 15. Pulling them to the right. With each one, we're seeing some improvement in the horizontal tight tensioning of the threads in the pattern. You can tell by my lack of narration there for a while that I was concentrating very heavily on making sure I had each of those threads pulled adequately, yet held sufficiently with my left thumb that I didn't pull them out. But here you now have the final R that has been packed horizontally. And now that we've got that done, it is safe to use some of the masking tape and bind down those right ends, because you don't want them to start dropping off the tape anchor while you're going through the rest of it. The next step is to do the vertical packing to make sure that we're as pleasing aesthetically vertically as we are horizontally. We need to push the top down a little bit, and you can move these threads a certain amount with this dull point bodkin. And there's the final R. We turn it through 180 degrees and start with the pull-out loop. I'll take the yellow thread and cut fairly close to it. Take my pull-out loop, snatch that out, And then I'm going to take a square-sided burnisher and pack the right margin, as you see here, then pack the left margin, and then I'm going to use my wax spatula as a burnisher to rub fairly hard on both design and background to smooth out those thread surfaces. That is now ready for the first coat of color preservative thread sealer. Put a full coat on the R. Be particularly careful to get a lot of sealer where the red thread comes out from under the yellow, because you want to lock that in for the next step. You let that dry overnight and then get ready for the next step, which is surgery. Here we are the next day after 2 coats of color preservative and thread sealer have dried on the complete design that you see there now. I've already trimmed the left margin, and I'm going to show you how to trim the right margin. Again, a very sharp blade is appropriate here, and you ought to cut this at about a 30-degree angle so that you have a smooth, gradual ramp up which you may wrap the trim thread, which we'll put on here in a moment. So here is the sharp blade actually cutting the red thread, and I'll use my hook to come in here and release that and make sure I'm getting a good sharp cut here. And I've got that cut, and I'm going to take this out of the way and get rid of it. We have both of them trimmed out, and what we're going to do next is to use a contrasting color as a trimming band, and I've chosen a green here. So what we'll do here is put a green trim band here, nail it down in the tape anchor, true up the edges, put in a pull-out loop, and keep that nicely tamped so that we can complete that. I'm going to cut this green thread now to get it out of the way. And you see we're about to start going up that ramp toward the yellow background thread. That's ready to be cut and put through the pull-out loop. Pull up snug, hold it tight, cut it off, pull out the loop, tamp it horizontally. As you can see, I'm not worried about getting my hands on the left-hand tape anchors now because they're completed. There is the green band trimming the left. You would do the same thing to put a trim band on the right. You would burnish it very carefully, being sure that you burnish the junction between green and yellow here to make the gaps disappear. Do the same thing on the right-hand side. You see I've added the trim band to the right, so there's your completed design, the R on the yellow background with the green trim bands, all complete, all ready for several more coats of color preservative and sealer, and as many coats as you usually use of your favorite epoxy finish. Two tools that we didn't talk about in the previous part of the tape are help for tired eyes or weak eyes, and I find these binocular loops to be particularly helpful. They go on top of my reading glasses, and when I'm doing particularly close work, I find that this lets me really see the threads and other details that I need to see. They're available from most any optician or optometrist that you'll find in your local area. The second device is a portable thread creel, merely a piece of 1 by 3 with a couple of 1-inch, 1/4-inch dowels on it that I put my spools of thread, a couple of pigtail guides, a couple of pieces of lead to hold it in place, and I can move this around anywhere I choose as I'm feeding thread to the rod to lay out my weaves. Something like this is an awful lot handier than trying to move your thread carriage of the rod lathe up and down. To me, a logical consequence to the capability of weaving that you just saw and you just learned is to personalize your custom rods. By personalizing, I mean make it a special rod to the angler that you're making it for, whether it's for you or for someone else. As an example, if you're making a rod for a doctor, weave a caduceus on it for him. If you're making a rod for somebody that works for the Shakespeare line people, weave his corporate logo on it. If you're making a rod to be raffled off for Ducks Unlimited, which I did several years ago, weave a Ducks Unlimited logo on it. You'll be surprised at how much it'll increase the cost of that rod to the ultimate bidder. Or go to someone's personal logo. I had to weave a rod for a man whose initials were TP, and you can imagine what his logo was. It was a teepee, and he was real tickled with that rod. Or you can find a pleasant scene that somebody will like that'll remind them of something, a good fishing experience, such as two people fishing in a canoe. I had another occasion where a music teacher liked to fish, and he liked music, and a treble clef made that rod very, very important to him. Then you find people that have got pretty high ideals as to what they're going to catch, a large quarry, and that's one of the things I wove my whale for. And that particular job interested the angler so much that he ordered 4 rods. So this resulted in a 4-rod parlay. Similarly, a Great Lakes customer wanted downrigger rods, and I wove on his rods a silhouette of his own boat, complete with downriggers on the stern. That was very pleasing to him, and another 4-rod order. If you happen to be working north of the border here, weave a Canadian flag. Or it doesn't have to have anything to do with fishing at all. This last example is a Scotty dog. The surf angler who had that put on his rod never went fishing without his Scotty dog as his constant companion. That rod meant an awful lot to him. All right, you've seen how to weave a single design on a single axis of the rod in a single silhouette color. This is basic. We've touched a little bit on how you can weave multiple axes to get several designs on the same segment of rod. This is really not much more, as you've found, than just making another left list. It increases your paperwork a little bit, but it's not much more complex. And there, more at the tail end of this conversation, we've talked about personalization, and that's where I think you'll really find the pleasure of weaving. So, having learned all of those things, I think you're all set to launch yourself on a very interesting sidelight to your rod building career, which is weaving, and I hope you enjoy it a great deal.